COVID means we've got dogs barking in the background, so please bear with me. Okay, so I just want to start this off, and we'll do this quick because I want to get into everything today, which is going to be great. So this is the first of our three-part cultural humility and empathy training series, which has been developed in partnership with future ancestors, who we're very excited to have here today. So each event in the series will focus on a different time period: the past, the present, and the future. And Future Ancestors calls this a braiding time series, and we're thrilled to be able to run these sessions with you. So the first event, which is this event, will focus on the past. We'll look at Indigenous legal systems, ways of doing justice, and the consequences of an imposed legal system. Today, we'll be joined by Métis Senator Constance Simmons. She's a retired Métis Senator, who will be providing a traditional opening and prayer, as well as Elder Verna McGregor and Samantha Matters, who will both discuss Indigenous legal systems and speak to the effects that our current system has on Indigenous communities. And we believe that in order to combat discrimination and create equitable justice, we must invest in the capacity to elevate empathy, increase our cultural awareness, and embrace humility in the justice sector. So that's what we're going to try and do today through our conversation. So I just want to give an introduction to Constance. Constance will be doing an opening prayer. Here's our agenda for today. So Constance is a Métis woman from Northern Saskatchewan, Treaty 6 territory. She is Cree and Scottish. Constance has served as a Métis senator for the Toronto and York Region Métis Council. Constance has served at the Indigenous community for over 40 years, specializing in complex addiction and mental health issues, both in BC and Ontario. She worked in both forensic outreach and forensic psychiatric unit. Constance also served as a Métis representative for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, and as an elder for the Indigenous Advisory Council at the Law Society of Ontario. Constance was a consultant with the U of T Faculty of Law Indigenous Studies Unit and a consultant for the Indigenous Unit at Women's College Hospital. She is a mother of two and grandmother of two, and I'm going to mute right now. Has been in working with our organization and doing opening prayers for some time now, and we're very lucky to have her here. So thank you so much, Constance. So I want to introduce Verna McGregor, who will share some knowledge about Indigenous legal systems, specifically looking at the themes of restorative justice and peace/coexistence. So just a brief opening for Elder Verna McGregor. She is from the Algonquin community, and which is approximately 120 kilometers north of Ottawa. Ottawa is part of the Algonquin Nation's traditional lands. Verna works as a Minishwanan Lodge, the Aboriginal Women's Center located in Ottawa. Services and resources provided by Minwanishan Lodge assist in the empowerment of Aboriginal women leaving violence. Verna has remained firmly grounded in her community and nation, but also being part of the group of traditional grandmothers and elders. This includes promoting the retention of Algonquin language and culture, which is so important when addressing issues and connection to land.
So I think Verna's internet was a little bit shaky at the beginning of the call. So I see that she's not on here anymore. So I think maybe we just had a little bit of an internet issue. So I'm wondering if we can jump ahead. I see Sam here, and we can come back to Verna once she's able to log back on. But I don't see her here.
So if I may interject for a moment.
Yes, of course.
I would kindly like to raise this glass of water on behalf of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and to those who have survived residential school and who are in deep grief as we bring the bones of our children from residential school home. I would like to remember them by drinking this water for them on their behalf. Aho miigwech.
Thank you, Constance. So, Sam, would you be ready to go now instead of Verna?
I can absolutely do that if we think that's appropriate. I don't want to take any space from Verna during our time together, but if y'all think that's appropriate, then I'm happy to go at this point as well.
Yeah, I'll get in touch with her and I'll try to get her in on by phone. But I think just because we only have such a short time together, it might be just wise to proceed. And then once she comes in, we can fill her slot if that works for you.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, cool.
All right, so I'm just going to grab some slides that I've created for us today. So just give me one moment here. And I also just wanted to take a moment to thank Constance for opening our space today and offering that prayer and acknowledgement to our kin and our relatives today. Thank you, Constance. So, as was mentioned at the beginning of our time together, I am from Future Ancestor Services. We've been working closely with Level Justice to prepare this training series for y'all. And this is part of our Braiding Time series. So we are going to be working together to kind of look across time in terms of the legal system and what we currently know as Canada, beginning with an exploration of the past. But we also recognize that time, as we like to situate it in a colonial way, meaning chunking out past, present, and future, isn't necessarily reflective of an Indigenous experience of time. So we recognize that the past influences how we behave in the present and will also reverberate into our futures. We recognize that we need to learn how to understand time kind of across its expanses. So in that way, we look at time as a braid, an intersection, a relationship between the past, present, and future. So while we like to break things down and put them into their boxes, through this series, we're also going to be exploring how time merges and how we need to, know where we come from to know where we're going. So that's why we're starting off today, our series. In the past, we're looking at Indigenous legal systems in what is currently known as Canada, and we're specifically going to look at what those systems looked like pre-European contact. Oh, I lost my mouse. There we go. So to start off, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. And this is something that I'm constantly thinking about as we all adapt to engaging in these virtual spaces. So while I'm offering my own land acknowledgement, I would encourage everyone on the call today to think about the land on which you find yourself, to think about your relationship with that land, and to think about how you came to be in that place. So as a Métis woman who carries mixed settler ancestry, living and working in Amaskwaci-Waskagan on Treaty 6 territory, I would like to acknowledge the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many other nations who have and continue to call this place home as the original caretakers of this land. Recognizing this land as the traditional Métis homeland, I acknowledge my own ancestors who brought me to and continue to call me back to this place, whose resilience and resistance will reverberate into the future to strengthen our collective descendants. I would also like to honor and acknowledge all Indigenous peoples from across what we currently know as Canada, who continue to do this important work of ensuring our shared safety and future here on Mother Earth. So Tanshe, Kia, Tanshe, Samantha Matters, Dishnakashon, Métis, Niayan, Amaskwaci-Waskagan, Niwiken. Hello, everyone. My name is Samantha Matters. As I mentioned, I'm joining you here from Edmonton or Amiskwichi, Waskagan, and I am Métis. I carry both Métis and mixed settler ancestry. So on my Métis side of the family, my mom's side, our family has roots in the Meadow Lake region of Saskatchewan, coming from the Ross and Collins families. And on my settler side, on my dad's side, our ancestors came to what we now call Alberta from Scotland and England several generations ago. So I'm joining you today as one of the founding directors of Future Ancestor Services. I had a chance to interact with Level Justice on a few occasions, including joining one of the cultural empathy and humility training sessions last year, and super excited to be here with you all to do some shared learning in this space today. So at Future Ancestors, this is our founding team. We are a Black and Indigenous owned and operated youth-led professional services social enterprise. So we offer training, research, and consulting services, and all of our work really seeks to advance climate justice and equity. And we do this through lenses of anti-racism and ancestral accountability. So for me, what this means is while we're here engaging in a space around the law and legal systems, we also need to be thinking about equity and about our relationship and connection to the land, and recognizing that we can't separate those things. They're inherently interconnected. So that's the lens that we bring to our work, and that I'm hoping to do throughout this series as well. So as I mentioned, just taking a minute to kind of set our intentions for the day, Inkiwi, Tutanan. The Braiding Time series is really meant to help us structure a conversation. So today I'm hoping to work with you all to explore our relationship with the past and our understanding of the past by looking at the consequences of imposing a legal system here on these lands, on Indigenous communities across these lands, following European contact. So looking at kind of that transition post-contact and what happens when we impose a very different sort of system on peoples. So we're going to take a look at kind of exploring Indigenous legal systems, take a look at what systems were practiced here pre-contact, but we're also going to take a look at how we can use our understanding of the past to really seek to acknowledge harm that exists in the present. So again, what were those consequences of imposing that system? And then finally, building on that knowledge, on that awareness, we're going to look at what our role is as lawyers, as law students, as legal practitioners in acknowledging and responding to that harm that we observe in the present day. So this is really rooted in a restorative approach to anti-racism that we engage with at Future Ancestor Services. So again, this is really central to our work, and we bring this restorative approach to anti-racism work in a way that allows us to acknowledge that harm, in a way that supports us in naming and taking accountability, a way that helps us commit to restorative actions, and importantly, center relationships across all of the work that we do. So if we think more tangibly about what this looks like, it's really important to recognize that this restorative approach is really rooted in teachings that we've gained from our elders and from our communities. So myself and our founding director, Larissa Crawford, have received these teachings around restorative practice and what that means. So I wanted to share this chart with y'all to kind of break down what we mean when we say a restorative approach to anti-racism. And we're going to hear a bit about restorative practice and restorative justice today. So I'm hoping this will set the tone and set the stage for the day. So when we're thinking about restorative practice, when we're thinking about restorative approaches, really our first step in those practices is to acknowledge harm. If we're coming into a space to do this restorative work, the first step is to acknowledge harm that's been done to individuals, to communities, or perhaps to the earth. So in anti-racist practice, this means that we really have to seek to understand the roots and the manifestations and the impacts of systemic racism. So as I'm kind of going through this chart, I'd encourage you to think about how you might engage with these principles or these practices in your own legal practice. So seeking to understand the roots of systemic racism, how might we engage with that? In a restorative practice, we're also asked to take accountability. So after we've acknowledged harm, we're asked to take accountability or responsibility for our actions and the impact that our actions have had, whether or not that's been intended. So how did our action, how did our behavior, how did our choices result in that harm that we've observed? And how can we take accountability for those impacts? So in an anti-racist approach, this looks like naming our roles in maintaining or upholding systemic racism and taking accountability for the racist impacts that we may have had, whether that comes through our actions, our behaviors, maybe policies or structures within our organization or sector, taking accountability for those impacts. We're then required to make actionable commitments in a restorative practice. So how are we committing to acknowledging, restoring, and building relationships following that harm that's been caused? So in our anti-racist approach, this means that we're working to make actionable and evidence-based commitments to restoring the harm that's been caused. And this can happen on both an individual and or a systemic or an organizational level. So naming those commitments, making those actionable steps to resolving that harm. And then finally, we really want to center relationships in our practice. So this happens across a restorative practice, a restorative justice approach. And for anti-racist work, this means that we have to do that really critical self-reflective work. And we have to engage in dialogue, and we have to learn from those around us as we pursue this work, as we develop relationships, because we recognize relationships are what makes this work sustainable. So this is how we understand our approach to anti-racism. This is how we integrate teachings around restorative practice into our work at Future Ancestor Services. And I wanted to provide this framework as a starting point for our conversation today. And we're going to take a minute to do a little bit of self-reflective work. So I'd love if we could all take maybe 3 minutes to reflect on these questions. How might you apply restorative anti-racist approaches in your legal work and your daily life? And also, how do these practices relate to client-centered learning? What's your understanding, or excuse me, client-centered lawyering? What is your understanding of client-centered lawyering? And how might that relate to these ideas of restorative anti-racist practice? And again, this is meant to be reflective, so there are no right or wrong answers. I'd encourage you to journal about your reflections as we're going. And I just wanted all to take about 3 minutes to pause and reflect on these questions in whatever way suits you best. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off for this next bit. Feel free to do the same if you would like, and we'll just sit for 3 minutes in reflection. All right. Thank you all so much for engaging in that self-reflection. Take a few more moments to wrap up your thoughts if you need. And yeah, just thinking about this practice of self-reflection. I think as lawyers, as future lawyers, it's really important to build this practice to be able to recognize the power that you hold in your roles within this system, within the justice system, within legal systems across Canada, and really look at how we can build capacity to listen to and understand clients, and how we can center relationships and center our clients' needs in our work together, and recognizing that fundamentally that is a relationship that we're engaged in. So at the end of the session, I have some additional resources for you all to take a look at. And one of them includes a piece on client-centered lawyering. So I'll be able to share that with you in a resource following the end of the presentation. But for now, we're going to move on to taking a look at Indigenous legal systems and what we currently know as Canada. And I'm using this phrase repeatedly here, what we currently know as Canada, to indicate that these lands have not always been known as Canada, nor do they always need to be known as Canada. So really opening up this train of thought to think about what might the future for these lands holds, and where, and how can we understand the history of these lands as well. So when we're talking about Indigenous legal systems in Canada, it's really important to recognize that there is this rich diversity of legal traditions and practices in Indigenous communities across the land. And it's also important to recognize that despite best efforts, these practices and systems still exist today. So I'm sharing this quote here with you, this from the Center for First Nations Government, that really speaks to this idea of the complexity of those Indigenous legal traditions and how they persist today. So it's really important that while we're looking at kind of these legal systems through this lens of looking at the past, it's important to remember that those were never lost, they were never extinguished, and they still exist, and in many cases are practiced today. So a quick note on some terminology. I just wanted to provide a distinction between Aboriginal law and Indigenous law. So when we're talking about Aboriginal law, we're talking about a system created by Canadian courts and legislatures that is fundamentally about the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown within the Canadian legal system. So Aboriginal law involves the interpretation of Indigenous rights that are recognized by the Canadian Constitution, and these other laws created by Canadian governments, such as the Indian Act or self-government agreements. So that's what we're speaking to when we're talking about Aboriginal law, are those systems created by Canadian courts. When we are talking about Indigenous law, we are talking about Indigenous people's own legal systems. So this includes the laws and legal processes developed by Indigenous peoples to govern their relationships, the way in which land is managed, the way in which conflicts are resolved, both within and across legal systems. So as with Canadian law, Indigenous law is developed from a variety of sources and institutions, which all differ across legal traditions. So in summary, Indigenous law refers to Indigenous people's own legal systems and processes. So if we think about law and legal systems, laws can arise whenever we have human interactions, and these really are about creating proper conduct. So Indigenous legal traditions were developed to create expectations about proper conduct or customary law, which then evolved into complex systems of law or legal traditions. So it's important to recognize that the laws of England were also created through this evolutionary process beginning with customary law, until we began to see precedent and consolidation in the 1700s. So bringing back our understanding to laws in their simplest form as guidance or a way to understand how we engage with one another. The same holds true for Indigenous legal traditions. And Indigenous peoples have developed various spiritual, political, and social customs and conventions to really guide these relationships. And oftentimes these are rooted in ceremony. So if we think about Indigenous communities and peoples across these lands, we know that there are many, many nations and communities, and therefore many, many different types of ceremonies and stories. And these vary according to each nation's history and circumstances and spiritual understanding and social structure. So Indigenous legal traditions are therefore as diverse as Indigenous communities themselves across these lands. So it's really important to remember that when we speak about Indigenous legal tradition, we always want to use that plural form, Indigenous legal traditions, recognizing that there are many and they vary across what we now call Canada. So both Indigenous legal traditions and Canada's civil and common law traditions are embedded in a culture of argument. So while we have this similar root, this culture of argument, we start to see some separation in terms of how these different systems take form. So on one hand, we have Canada's legal traditions, which are adversarial, whereas most Indigenous legal traditions are not. So this is where we're starting to see that imposition of one system onto another. And again, just noting that while individual communities are distinct and separate, resulting in distinct and separate legal traditions, it's also important to recognize that Métis, Inuk, First Nations all have their own systems and protocols and teachings regarding on legal systems and legal practices. So again, a note to remember that these are very, very diverse systems and traditions. One of the resources that I'll be sharing with you is from John Borrells of the University of Victoria, who speaks to this diversity. So sharing this quote to kind of recognize again that the way in which these systems take place happen in very different ways across the country. And it's important for us to be able to recognize and distinguish those different systems. So I wanted to take a moment to look at this idea of re-indigenizing restorative justice. And our elder Verna is going to be speaking in depth about restorative justice. So I won't spend too much time here, but I think this is a term that we are getting more and more comfortable with hearing. And it's really important for us to recognize that mainstream restorative practices come from and are informed by Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous peoples around the world. So if you were to Google restorative justice, you're going to start to see that that acknowledgement doesn't always take place. We start to see a lot of co-opting of this idea of restorative justice or restorative practice without recognizing that those practices really are grounded and rooted and stem from Indigenous peoples. So this is important for us to think about, especially as we're starting to engage in conversation around decolonizing the justice system, for example. We have to be able to acknowledge where these systems and these learnings come from, recognizing that Indigenous people have not and still do not have equitable access to the legal system in Canada as it stands today. So Indigenous peoples often don't have access to lawyers. Indigenous people often are overrepresented in the justice system. Indigenous peoples weren't allowed to hire lawyers until 1951 under the Indian Act. So it's important for us to recognize and acknowledge where restorative justice stems from as we look at transitioning perhaps how our legal system operates, because we know that historically and contemporarily, Indigenous peoples have faced sorry, I just got very distracted by the chat. I'm going to close that now. Indigenous peoples have faced a systemic lack of access and systemic discrimination within the justice system. So again, I'm not going to spend too much time. I'm going to leave this for Elder Verna on looking at restorative justice. But essentially what we're looking at here is a way, again, of repairing and restoring relationships when harm has been caused. So restorative justice refers to doing that restorative work within the context of a formal justice system. So during our restorative process, we're not necessarily placing our focus or emphasis on specific events, but we're looking at identifying how the harmony or how the relationships within a group were disrupted and how we can then restore them. So this involves all parties when we're engaging with restorative justice practices. It involves the perpetrator of a crime or a harm, the victim, the family members, the community members. Everybody is involved in restorative justice practice, recognizing the intent is to restore harmony to all lives within that group. And this is in contrast to a European-based justice system that is now practiced across North America. So the Western adversarial justice system is rooted in proof, guilt, and punishment. So we're seeking to identify who committed, who caused the harm, how will they be punished, and how will victims be compensated, which you can see is fundamentally different from an approach that seeks to restore relationship and harmony among all parties. So it's important to understand that this contrast between systems was used as a colonial tool, as a tool of colonial power to erase and assimilate Indigenous communities from these lands. And by imposing these systems, this is where we start to see some of the consequences that we observe in the justice system today. So when we have this retributive justice under an adversarial system, we start to see how that can be utilized to facilitate the erasure of Indigenous communities. And some of the resulting consequences from that include warfare and confinement that's stemming from this system that really sought to prevent Indigenous peoples from growing and gathering food, reducing self-reliance, self-sufficiency, and creating that system in which Indigenous communities were really dependent on the state. And this is coming through, again, laws and legal systems, including the Indian Act. So we see legislation and military presence that's affecting almost every aspect of life, for Indigenous peoples. So we have self-government that's prohibited. We have spiritual practices that are prohibited. We have traditional methods of conflict and dispute resolution that are no longer allowed to be practiced. And we also have the dispossession and removal of Indigenous peoples from their land. We have the forced removal of successive generations of children as part of these violent methods that are used to control and destroy Indigenous nations and cultures. Again, all rooted in this retributive justice system. So I want to share a quick tool that I like to use to help understand kind of the root causes for these consequences and the root causes for what we observe in the legal system today in terms of overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. And it's called causal layered analysis. So essentially what this framework is asking us to do is to look beyond kind of that surface level of an issue or a challenge that's taking place. So kind of the trends or the public buzz or the news headlines that we hear, and look deeper down into the structures that are in place, the systems that are in place that give rise to those outcomes. So we look kind of below the surface of the water in this iceberg metaphor, and we start to deepen our analysis by looking at the worldview that's in place that really guides these systems and structures. How does that make them or legitimize them? And then we look even deeper than worldview, and we look at what are the myths and the metaphors that we carry, whether we're aware of them or not, those deep stories, those collective understandings that really give rise to our worldview. So causal layered analysis is just a tool for looking at what's really going on beneath an issue. So to go through an example, I wanted to do a little bit of a compare and contrast and kind of walk through how we use this tool by looking first at restorative justice within an Indigenous legal system. So if we look at the top level of the iceberg, this is what we commonly hear or commonly see happening around this space. So we see a community-led approach to Indigenous legal traditions. We see an interest in reintegrating with the community after harm has been caused. We see that there's this concerted effort to separate an action from a person, from an individual. And we see this importance of ceremony and prayer. So if we think about the systems or the structures that enable those observations, we can see that in a restorative justice, with restorative justice in an Indigenous legal system, we have an emphasis on creating systems that enable relationship and dialogue. We have systems that are built around maintaining harmony and balance. And we have this idea of renewal, of seeking to, again, restore or repair relationships. So these are the structures or the causes that give us those observations in the top level of our CLA analysis. Looking even deeper, we can start to look at worldviews that might be operating to inform these systems of relationship and dialogue and harmony. So a worldview that often informs Indigenous legal traditions is that first and foremost, we recognize each individual person as part of a community, and that we can't be separate from our community. There's an emphasis on collaboration, recognizing that our well-being is inherently linked to our community's well-being. And the myth or the metaphor really that informs this understanding is this idea of Wokotowin, or this sense of all my relations, recognizing again that we're all deeply interconnected, not just with our human kin, but with the earth, with our non-human kin. So you can see as you dig down deeper into the iceberg, you can start to see what is really rooting this idea or this practice of restorative justice in Indigenous legal systems. And again, recognizing that it's important not to fall into that pan-Indigenous trap, that these may appear different across communities, across nations. But if we do, again, our kind of compare and contrast activity, so looking at retributive justice within an adversarial system, we can kind of do a similar deep dive if we want. So where on the left-hand side, we were talking about community-led approaches, we're now looking at this idea of having a defendant and a prosecutor. We're hearing a lot about incarceration and prison rates, again, linked to this idea of punishment. We have this idea that criminals are inherently wicked and should be separated from the community. And we also have this separation of church and state. So again, in contrast to this idea of centering ceremony and prayer as part of our legal system. So some of the systems that really lead us to these outcomes are this idea of, again, proof and guilt and punishment and compensation being the ultimate goals. These antagonistic disputes where we have one side versus the other, rather than a focus on bringing people together to do restoration collaboratively. So if you think about a worldview that might guide these kind of systems, and we can start to see these across colonial systems, is this prioritization of individual rights and self-actualization. So in a Western or Eurocentric system, we're really focused on this idea of competition rather than collaboration. So these are two fundamentally different worldviews, right? So we can start to understand how they have fundamentally different impacts in terms of the way we understand legal systems. And the myth or the metaphor that I named for this system is this idea of me against the world. So that idea that is held onto in a lot of European cultures and a lot of colonial cultures is this idea of, again, self-actualization. It's me against everyone else. This understanding that we exist as purely individuals rather than members of a community or members of the earth, even in some cases. So if we understand those kind of deeper level causes, then we can start to make sense of some of the impacts or the consequences that we see. So again, when we're looking at imposing retributive justice and an adversarial legal system on Indigenous peoples and communities who practice restorative justice within their own systems, this is where we can start to see the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the justice system. This is where we start to see systemic discrimination and systemic racism arise in the outcomes of an adversarial legal system. So I'm thinking about court cases such as the Gerald Stanley case. This is where we start to see socioeconomic marginalization in terms of who can access adequate legal representation. And this is where we start to see intergenerational trauma stemming from, again, those laws that were put in place to erase and assimilate Indigenous peoples. So this is going to be the main focus of our second session. So we'll be taking a look at systemic racism as it exists and as it is observed in the legal system in Canada. So if you come to the next session, this is going to be our focus, and we're going to do some of that really important work of acknowledging harm that occurs presently within the Canadian justice system as a result of this imposition of an adversarial legal system on Indigenous peoples. So hopefully you can start to see how this is going to link together. So I had an activity for us to do to start doing this work of naming accountability. I recognize that we only have a bit of time left, and I want to leave a lot of time, as much as I can, for Verna. So I'm going to share this activity with y'all post-workshop, so you'll be able to go through it as an individual or perhaps with your colleagues or classmates. But essentially, I have a series of prompts for us to start thinking about, what do I know about Indigenous legal systems in Canada? What do I know specifically about the Indigenous legal systems in my area, where I live, where I work, where I play? What is my responsibility to those legal traditions that are practiced on the land on which I find myself? And how can I start to commit to deepening my understanding of these Indigenous legal traditions? So again, I'll share this as a follow-up or a takeaway activity for y'all to engage with following the session today. But just quickly, I wanted to highlight that I had my lovely colleague, Chanel Couture, who is also a director of ancestral services at Future Ancestors. Hi, Chanel, who helped me construct this session today. Merci, Chanel. Chanel is also currently a law student, so brought their expertise in helping me understand and also share this content with you all today. All of the research that I use that Chanel pointed me towards will be included in the slides that I'll also share with you. So you'll be able to take a look at the sources that we use to craft this session today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Sam. That was amazing. I'm seeing some nice thoughts in the chat here. So one question for you. Someone asked if the presentation will be available for future reference. So I just wanted to check with you, and maybe we can chat after the session about, yeah, sharing that out, because I think so much of the information that you just ran through is so excellent, and I'd love for participants to be able to, yeah, refer back to that. It was really well done. And yeah, thank you to Chanel as well. I know she worked really hard on this too. So I would love to now introduce Verna so that we can have Verna present a little bit about Indigenous legal systems, talk a little bit about the themes of, yeah, restorative justice, like I know Sam just touched on, and also talk a little bit more about peace and coexistence and how those are some themes that feature in Indigenous legal systems as well. So I'm just going to spotlight Verna now. But before I do, I just wanted to introduce Verna again. I know we had introduced you, but your internet had cut out. So just as a refresher for the group, Elder Verna McGregor is Algonquin from the Kitigan Zibi Anishinaabeg community, which is approximately 120 kilometers north of Ottawa. Verna works at Minwashin Lodge, the Aboriginal Women's Support Center located in Ottawa. Service and resources provided by Minwashin Lodge assist in the empowerment of Aboriginal women leaving violence. Verna has remained firmly grounded in her community and nation by also being part of the group of traditional grandmothers and elders. This includes promoting the retention of the Algonquin language and culture, which is so important when addressing issues in connection to the land. We're so thrilled to have Verna here with us today to share a bit about those themes that I was just discussing. So I'm going to spotlight her so everyone can see her, and I'll let you take it away.
Oh, thank you, Caitlin. I had to move. Wait, I'm just going to turn off my light. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm coming to you from my community, and that's why I think I have my internet cuts out. So it might cut out, so I'm going to talk really fast. I have some slides that I sent to Caitlin because really, I'm just going to go through them really quickly, and I hope I don't cut out. So I'll start with the next slide. Next, please. Actually, yeah, I would say Kwe Vernon Indigenous, Kitagonsi Vin Doja Bawa, Goshnedo, Demashajanum Kipanesi, Natajin and on the Dodan is Oshinongo. Okay, I do a lot of openings and talks in Ottawa, and lately I've been doing a lot with Climate Change Canada and impact assessment. But when I always start, I start from the beginning. For us, we call this, for people, we call North America Turtle Island. And they said, why did they call North America Turtle Island? Well, you see from a satellite view, and I caught this off Facebook here, but this is what I've been told since I was a child, but they call it Mikanak Minising, which is North America is shaped like a turtle. But there's some teachings to that too, and that's tied to governance. And especially too as well, if you look at the turtle, it has the 13 shells on its back. That represents for us, again, a different understanding of the 13 moons, the 13 grandmothers. And around there, you'll see the shells, and that's also part of like a senate. So it's tied to our original governance as well. And it's tied to our creation stories prior to contact. So, and for us, as Algonquin, we're known as Omamininawag, which means the nomads. And we had big territories. Why? Because the understanding is that if we move, stayed one place, you over-harvest the resources. So again, too, as well, that's why our hunting territories we were more hunting, and our Haudenosaunee or Mohawk, Iroquois brothers and sisters were more, they were more agricultural, and they were more further south too as well. Because if you look here, it's regional specific. It's wasn't very conducive for farming. So we had also our own systems of trade prior to contact, and that's still in our oral histories. Next, please. Again, really prior to contact, they estimated that there was about 112 million in 1492. And by 1650, there was less than 6 million people. So again, that's again the devastation of contact here as well. When I say to as well, welcome to our, I'll go to the next slide now and I'll explain it more. Next, please. Here in Ottawa, which is the nation's capital, is our traditional unceded lands. Again, what does it mean? We haven't signed treaty in connection to the land. And that's the diversity too of the different nations across Turtle Island, but also what they know now as Canada. And for us, we are known for the canoe and our clan system. When I say, well, Fox is my clan on my mother's side, and my the Thunderbird is a clan on my father's side. That would be our official introduction traditionally. Why? Because the clan system was based on the watershed. So the significance of Ottawa is that we would come together here in the summer and talk about what's going on the land. And that was part of our land management system too, as well, in addition to our governance, in addition to the tying to the legal system. So again, too, and the biggest difference too, as well, as I'd say too, with the clash of the newcomers or European concept, it was also this understanding of the role of women. And for us to, I always say this in the beginning, when you talk about diversity, as you're mentioning earlier, diversity starts with the basics, with the male female. And our understanding was that although our roles were different with the male and female, it didn't mean one was superior to the other, that we balanced each other in order to bring in the next generation. So again, too, as well, so that clash, and I'm going to talk about more of the clash of understandings here today. And I'm going through these slides really well because I have a poster at the end that I want to talk about as well. Next, please. No, okay, really what I did is I included the Chaudière Falls because that's where the previous slide, that's where we would meet here. And this is one of our sacred sites. And when we'd come here in the summer, we would meet by the Chaudière Islands. Since then, this has been dammed. And if you go to Ottawa, you'll see that right in the middle of the Ottawa River. Why I talk about this too as well is that section was dammed in 1904, and in 1904 there was no environmental assessment, impact assessment, and we weren't even allowed to protest, and we were also really scattered forcibly, really. But what happened there too as well with the damming of the river, today what happens is too as well, it wiped out a number of species, most notably the American eel. It saw a decline of, it's down by 99%. And the oral history, there was once salmon in the river. And again too as well, the name for salmon in Algonquin is Odaujamek, and I always wonder where Ottawa comes from too as well. But again, that's where just really, now, when you talk about environmental law today too as well, how we're evolving now too as well with the Supreme Court rulings, whereas there's this duty to consult. And we're still grappling with that in terms of who consult with who. And also though too, but as we're evolving to that too as well, what happened is Ontario Hydro and Ottawa Hydro came to our community about 6 years ago. And they sort of, it was sort of like a nuisance that they had to consult. So what I said is, one of the things I mentioned, I said, well, this is our unceded lands. I said, so what about resource revenue sharing for the amount of for the hydro you're deriving from that? So they got all upset and they were talking about the shareholders. I said, well, never mind. I said, the other part is, I said, when you built the dams, there was no environmental assessment. So it wiped out a number of species. Can you do something to maybe heal the species? I said, because this reconciliation is not only about the European newcomers coming here and instilling their systems, but also what we as humans have done also to other species. That's also reconciliation. It goes deeper. So I said, so there's this, I understand there's this thing called a fish elevator. Can you install something like that in order to maybe restore and bring back the species? And really, and we didn't hear from them. So about 3 years later, they came back, and today they have a fish elevator installed there. And there was a female engineer, and she worked on this, and she said that I had to work and change the grade for the baby eels to pass. And she goes, now they're close to my heart. But at the same time, too, as well, I said that's reconciliation as well, in terms of the industrialization that was done, and also because if you look at it today, the Ottawa River watershed has 52 dams on it. So again, too, as well, there's the justice system. It touches on that justice system and the duty to consult. Next, please. Now, going back to this chaudière, to the why we'd meet to as well, at the center, this is the medicine wheel. And there's a lot of teachings to this medicine wheel. It represents the 4 directions: the north, east, southwest, the 4 seasons. The need for balance at the center always represents the balance between your emotional, physical, spiritual, and mental. So also one of the biggest teachings of this too as well is to honor everybody's journey here. So if you see the line between the white part and the yellow part on the east, okay, it represents too as well a new day, but also the beginning of somebody coming from spirit. When you are born, you take your first breath and you begin your earth journey here around the medicine wheel as an infant. Then you progress into a toddler, into an adolescent, into adulthood, and then to becoming a senior or an elderly in preparation to return back to spirit, back to creator. But one of the biggest teachings where this restorative justice comes along to as well is that we all come here with our own ways of knowing, our own spirit, but also to as well on our earth journey here. Sometimes we fall off of our out of line, or we get lost. And that's where, because our understanding is we come here all inherently good, we all come here with our own gifts. So what happens too sometimes is when we fall off our path, we need to return back to that path. And that's where things like restorative justice comes in. That and I'll go into that too as well with the poster at the end, and I'll maybe tell a story about this restorative justice, because I was part of this too, because I would sit with the grandmothers in the lodge with Elder William Commanda, who's my uncle. So but also too as well, there's other stories that I've heard. And when Samantha was talking about restorative justice, this was brought out with the Royal Commission. Even before that, there were stories of that, but also then it sort of took off in terms of this understanding of how there's a different way of maybe looking at the justice system. Next, please. For us, we weren't known for the teepee, but because of the abundance of the birch bark in the trees here, we're known for the wigwam, the pikogan. They call that pikogan. It's shaped like an oval, like if you see the sweat lodge too as well. It represents the womb of a woman. And that was our lodging. It was temporary. I show this too as well with, for example, I showed this as an example with Climate Change Canada, because I said our understanding that is we come here, we do our circle, we return. It was our lodging was temporary, as compared to today. The understanding is that you build your lodging to last forever. I said I still think it's like a historical memory where you have to build castles like in Europe. But I said, but what happens is, I said, now what happens when everybody wants a castle? And if you look at the capitalist system too, as well, it's geared to that, where it's bigger, 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 and more. But I said now, but what happens when now today we have big issues with sprawl, and we're in the age of climate change, and with the destruction of the ecosystem. That's again, when I talk about the contrast of a native and non-native view. uh, I, I I use housing as an example too as well. And I said it's not that one is superior to the other, but I said sometimes too as well. I think our biggest challenge now is, how do you find a balance? How do you find a balance in terms of bringing back our biodiversity, where because of our development, there's a recent report where we've also decimated 80% of the biodiversity on this planet. So again, how does the legal system come into play with that too as well? And going back to an example is also, a number of years ago, I was part of with Elder William Commanda. He asked me one Friday, "You going to come and protest with me?" And he was like 90 in a wheelchair. I said, "Well, I guess I have to." And he went up to Sharbet Lake, and it was for a uranium mine that they were going to build. And this eventually led to one of the professors from Queen's University going to jail, Robert Lovelace. And one of the arguments was too as well. You have common law, you have civil law, the civil code, the Code Civil. But our understanding is, because common law, civil law is man's law. What about natural law? And what happens too as well, I said, with the an example with the mine, it's a short-term initiative. The mines last around 30 years, but then what happens when you contaminate the water? Who's responsible for that? So again, too as well, their big case was, we are protesting on behalf of natural law. And the judge didn't know how to rule on that, so it was thrown out of court. So again, that's this evolution. And a lot of times too, our understandings were very female based, while the European was based on a lot of patriarchy. And again too as well, is how do you bring back balance? Next, please. So I'm going to talk really quickly too about the wampum belts again. As Samantha mentioned, one of the things too as well, in terms of, yes, it wasn't long ago you had to enfranchise to attend post-secondary education. This was taken out really in the mid 60s, and people started to trickle in the 70s to go to university. If you go on a reserve too, we had the pass system. And I remember that you weren't allowed to leave the reserve. My parents, or you needed permission from the Indian agent to leave the reserve and to return. So the other part is, you weren't allowed to, as mentioned, Earl Samantha mentioned, you weren't allowed to hire a lawyer. But also, as the reserve, why did they create also the reserve system where you weren't allowed to leave? Is also because it prevented the parents and grandparents from going to try and retrieve their children in residential school. But while that was going on too as well, there was also this confiscation of our sacred items. And there was also the banning of the gatherings, as mentioned earlier. And today, a lot of our items are found in the museums. I just was at the National Gallery last week, and a lot of our items too are on display. But one of the most sought after items was the wampum belts. And I'll just go to the next slide, please. I'm trying to talk really quickly. But first of all, it was mentioned earlier with the ceremony. And again, the importance of ceremony. When we'd have big gatherings or anything with the justice system, a lot of time, and I've also been in the lodge, you start with a pipe ceremony. And the pipe understanding is that also really quickly, you see the stem and the bowl where you put the tobacco in is the bowl, the stem. The bowl represents the female and the stem represents the male. So if you're a pipe carrier, you would keep that separate, because it's the understanding that the male female have their own spirit. So when you're coming together for ceremony, or for example, restorative justice, a traditional restorative justice gathering, the pipe carrier would connect that, and then they put in the tobacco. He or she would fill the tobacco, the bowl with tobacco, and you're calling in all the ancestors, meaning all your ancestors, all our past ancestors, but also all the plant life, all the animals, the star beings, the waters, the air, the winds. That's why pipe ceremony might take so long, because you're calling in all these. And it's a reminder to the people that the decisions you're making also, because of the interconnectedness of everything, it's a reminder that when you make decisions, you don't make decisions lightly, because of the interconnectedness of everything. With the connection of the bowl and the stem, that represents the sacredness of the coming together of the male and female. So it's always a reminder also of the sacredness of the union, and to not take that lightly, because it is also too as well, the most important is the bringing in of new life. Next, please. Now, going back to the ceremonial objects that were confiscated, one of them was well, a lot of them. I sat with, I still do, with the professors from the University of Pennsylvania, who do the on the wampum trail, and they have done research, but they've come up to our community. And what is wampum? Instead of the written word, we had our sacred items, and one of them is wampum. It's almost like a 3 dimension, and this could be a whole 2 hours. So really quickly, you see they're made of 2 shells, the shell of the quahog and the shell of the whelk. The whelk is white, the quahog is purple. The wampum belts are called peace treaty belts because it's honoring the contrast. When you have conflict, sometimes you have the conflicting understandings, and the wampum is, it comes together, showing the weaving together of contrasting views so that you can coexist peacefully. So just as an example, and that's how I said how deep this understanding is. The whelk, okay, in the wild, the quahog would prey on the whelk. The darker the shell of the quahog, that means it's an older shell, while the whelk is a younger shell, a younger species. So it's honoring that contrast of the young and the old, but one preys on the other. So how can they coexist without destroying each other? If that's just the items used, we don't get into the symbolism, and the symbolism of this one also too, as well, as I mentioned earlier. There's 2 interpretations of that by just changing the belt. Right here, it looks like an axe because it represents maybe war, but when you flip it over, it represents the peace pipe. So again, too, as well, it's the symbolism, but how deep they are in terms of this understanding. So it was just a different way of knowing, as opposed to the written word that we have today. Next, please. Again, too, as well, really quickly, this is Elder William Commanda, who I would sit in the lodge with. He's showing up here this long belt. It's a 7-diamond belt. We still have this in our community. It's a 7-fire prophecy belt. It foretold the newcomers coming to the lands here to Turtle Island. Then the prophecy is that because of the development, there's going to come a time where we will be at a crossroads, where the development, we are overdeveloping to the detriment. And the 7 diamonds represent also the 7 generations. The middle diamond represents, there's two diamonds in there. It represents a crossroads. Either it represents that everybody, if there's an awakening of the people to understand why we lived the way we did, why we had the systems that we had, including the justice system. Or because if we continue on the road that we're on right now, it would lead to the detriment of the next 7 generations. We may not have 7 generations. And even just 20 years ago, they said, oh, that's just so far away. And today, look at, we're in a climate change crisis, really. And again, I find it's funny today we're coming together and talking about even visiting in original justice systems too, because again, maybe we have to incorporate nature's law into changing the common law and the civil code and that understanding. The second one at the bottom represents um, the sharing belt, and it represents the French, because we as Algonquin were one of the first also to meet also the explorers, which the French and the British. So this belt represents the joining of hands between the British, the Anishinaabe or Algonquin or Native people, and the French, and the understanding. And it was, you see the cross, it represents to the Vatican. That's a long story, but at the same time, it represents that the understanding was there was going to be a sharing of the lands and resources here in 3 equal parts, but that didn't happen because of colonization in this whole story of unfolding through the Indian Act. But again, too, as well, that's what our covenants were, our understandings. Next, please. And in the end, before I go to the other poster, this is really quickly, this is what we worked on with Manuel Baez, who's a professor at Carleton University in architecture. He wanted to do something for Canada's 150th birthday. So at the bottom here, you see the circle. The circle represents Turtle Island. And what he did was he etched, it's the cross section of a tree, and he etched the lines because the tree does record time. And he had 4 benches in the 4 directions, representing the newcomers coming to Turtle Island from the 4 directions and Canada's growth outwards, because Canada is a young country. It's only now 154 years old since Confederation. And on top, he put the dream catcher, which has a lot of more of a deeper understanding. It represents the spider teachings, that the spider weaves the web of life, and that it also represents the interconnectedness of everything, that everybody belongs in the circle, but also too as well what your role here too as well. When sometimes you think you're not important, you're important because you're also, because of, you belong in the interconnectedness of everything. So that's why I think meetings like this are so important. Now, next, please.
I'm
Now I
just going
have
to get
my
the
point.
image up and then we're good to go.
Okay, while she's getting the image up too as well, I sit with, I've been doing this a long time. My background has been in not only working, I'm in Washington Lodge, my background's been in economic development, banking, real estate, and I studied economics. But it was like, I always like this thing about two-eyed seeing, because it's almost like my life, because I would come home and sit with the elders in the lodge and go in the bush, but then go back in the city. So, but for us too as well, another understanding is that we have our own constitution. We call that Inokanagowan, and it's based on it's nature based compared to the Canadian Constitution, which is the divvying up the land, and also to as well the power over the resources. Our understanding, our constitutional understanding, is very different to that, which also incorporates ceremony, which I won't go into that very much, but and also because of that too as well, we had no jails in the police system, because it was that communal policing. So, so one of the people I'd sit in the lodge with would be also with William and all the elders, but Douglas Cardinal would come in too as well. And one day he gave me this poster, and it's something what he did with the native, the non-native, and the native worldviews. And he said it's the contrast, and he started with the governance on top, saying that again too as well. It's the non-native understanding is based on a hierarchy, the hierarchical society based on a pyramid where the person at the top leads, while the native understanding is that of the circle. Everybody belongs in the circle. So the person at the top on a non-native makes the decisions, and it gets flown through down, while everybody in the circle, it's made by consensus. The advantage of a hierarchy is that you can get decisions done a lot quicker, while the circle is time consuming because everybody is consulted, including the children and the elders. It's not just because you're 18, you're allowed to vote. So it's that different understanding, and this was recorded in the explorers, where they would get so angry at the Indians because they said they can't make a decision, they take so long, and we want to get to the west, and we want to exploit the resources really. So again too as well, that's that understanding. You go at Parliament Hill, you see that it's based on a hierarchy. And I said the problem with the hierarchy too as well is, what if you have a leader at the top that's not well balanced? I said, like what happened to our neighbors to the south and a couple of years ago. Again, the system operates by man's law, and I mentioned earlier nature's law, the native understanding. The Dane was a patriarchal system. Ours was not matriarchal; it's more matrilineal. It's the women a lot of times who held also the property rights. There wasn't the property rights. It's a complex system. The other part now going down is when he talks about the legal system. And the legal system, you see the little man standing there, and Samantha mentioned that as well. It's like adversarial, and when a ruling is met, it's based on good and evil, win or lose. Well, the native understanding was that of a crooked good, that we all come here inherently good, and sometimes we fall off course. And it's up to the community also to try and put the person back on course. The other one is going back with the education system. He said a lot of times they think like with the students are tabula rasa, where the students or the children are born with a clean slate, and all you have to do is fill them up with knowledge that's been passed down, theories, and you're only smart when we give you your diploma, your degree. The native understanding is that also that we come here with our own ways of knowing. And going further down, they said you're only smart when you get your degrees or diploma, your credentials. But sometimes too as well, the native understanding is the experiential learning, but also not coming from knowledge is also, what he said is coming from knowledge is powerful, because yes, but also not coming from knowledge is also powerful, because also you're using your intuition and your creativity. So how do you balance that? So the other part is now, at the bottom, he comes down to one leads to, now here are the cities, while the other one, the opposite, is nature based. So again, he goes, not one is not sort of superior to the other. I think our biggest challenge is, how do you balance that? How do you take the benefits of one and the benefits of the other, or it sometimes may not relate to the one or the other. So I'm going to tell you a story about, also really quickly, on the restorative justice that I was part of a couple of years ago. there was a youth, he stole a car and he injured another person. And so what happened is his lawyer, who'd come into lodge with us, negotiated with the judge. And he said, as part of his sentencing, because he still had to do jail time, he goes, a part of his sentencing though is I want him to come in the lodge with the grandmothers. And so we started Saturday morning. And again, we started with the pipe ceremony. But he came in and his family came in. We didn't go as far as bringing in the person he had injured, their family, because I think we would have been there for 2 days. But he had to sit there all day and listen to how his actions impacted just his family, and it was very emotional. So what happened is, at the end, the grandmothers got up and said, "You know why we brought you in here? It wasn't to punish you. It was to show you why your family is here all day. It took the time all day Saturday to come here is because they love you. And why we're having this session too is to show you that maybe to learn that maybe next time you think you were operating in isolation with what you did with stealing the car and injuring this other person, but look at all the people you've impacted today, and that's just your family by your actions. So if you think you're operating in isolation in the future, because your family loves you, you impact them too. And you impact your community. So that's restorative justice. So 2 years later, the grandmother came. She saw me at the gas station. She goes, he goes, just by that session, like he's a changed person. And I said, oh, that's good, because he's never committed any other crime, or whatever. And I said, yeah, it's because we're watching him too. But that's where I think this restorative justice is too, as opposed to when they were talking about, like I worked in domestic violence too. What happens is when they say, the elders say, what happens when you throw the men in jail? They learn new skills and they come out angrier. So again, that's again going back to an example of the poster. How do you balance that? Because you're not going to get, it works for some, but it doesn't work for everybody. So that's the complex journey we're on. So I thank you for listening, and I'm glad my internet lasted this long.
Thank you so much, Verna. I think that's such a nice theme to end on, the idea of balance and how do we proceed in this complex journey we find ourselves on. I just want to say a big thank you to all the speakers we had today, Verna, Samantha, Constance. I really enjoyed the richness of this discussion, and it seems like based on the chat, it sounds like many of you did as well. Just as a reminder, we're going to be hosting 2 more of these events on the present and the future. Those will be held later in the year. So if you follow us on social media, you'll see. And just before we go, I just wanted to check, Constance, did you want to do a closing before we take off?
I do. Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
But before I do a closing, I want to say thank you to Samantha for that thought-provoking presentation that makes me think that out of that presentation will come a lot more discussion. And to say to Elder Verna how privileged I feel to sit with you, and that you would share your cultural wisdom. I feel like that's a deep well I would like to fall into so that I could learn more from you. You have such a good healing manner of presenting the wisdom. So from my heart to yours, I say Chimigwich. And now I would like to say that, that fire was burned and that tobacco was laid down and that prayer was sealed.